This is NewsHour, live from the BBC. I'm Tim Franks. Long delayed, long promised. We're still waiting for the White House to present its grand plan for resolving one of the world's longest-running conflicts between Israel and the Palestinians. In the meantime, there remain those in the region, day in, day out, year in, year out, who are fighting over the terrain. Not with violence, but in the case of the Israeli lawyer Michael Sfard, in court. Over the last 14 years, he's garnered a reputation as Israel's most prominent human rights lawyer, with a particular focus on fighting for Palestinian clients against the effects of the occupation. What's changed now, he says, quietly but profoundly, is the nature of that occupation.
Well, when the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, is enacting a law that basically instructs the military commander of the occupied Palestinian territory to confiscate Palestinian privately owned lands to which Israeli settlers have trespassed into and allocate them to the trespassers, well, that's a violation of probably the only principle that the Israeli Supreme Court has guarded, and that is that private Palestinian property should not be violated. And when the Israeli government is coercively transferring Palestinian communities from their place of residence in order to allow development of Israeli settler communities, that is an affront to basic tenets of international humanitarian law and laws of belligerent occupation. And it is doing so today without trying to say that their interpretation of what is allowed or what is prohibited under international law is different than the interpretation of the international community. It just says we, the Israeli parliament, have the power to do so, hence we do so, and this is what the majority of Israelis ask us to do.
What do you say to the charge that is often levelled against you, which is that in decrying what Israel is doing when the government would argue that it's trying to face down an intransigent, often violent population in the West Bank, when you talk about Israel trampling on legal norms, when you use terms like apartheid, you are delegitimizing the Israeli state, and essentially you're doing Israel's enemies' work for them.
This is, of course, a manipulation of everything that I do and say. I am an Israeli. I was born in Israel. I was raised in Israel. I served in the Israeli army. And so these kind of statements are meant to block the discussion, are meant to delegitimize my views, and instead of answering to the merits of what I argue, they are meant to stop me from actually placing my views in the market of ideas. I have to say that I've never said anything that suggests that Israeli forces should not have the ability to protect Israeli lives and Israel's security. To the contrary, I think it's their obligation to do so. But there are many, many practices that are being implemented in the occupied Palestinian territories that have nothing to do with security. The colonization of the West Bank has nothing to do with security. If anything, the settlements are posing a security burden rather than providing security to the state of Israel. When Israel has constructed the separation barrier, and I've been involved in many litigations challenging certain segments of the barrier, my argument was not there's no need for a barrier. My argument was that Israel is exploiting the understandable concern of many Israelis of Palestinian terror to grab as much land as possible, and the route was not designed according to security needs, but according to expansion of settlements fantasies. And indeed, in some of my cases, the court has upheld my position and ruled that expansion of settlements were the guiding principle in constructing the route of defense.
But equally, you raise the issue of the barrier. One of the criticisms from the left is that in those partial victories that you may have had about the routing of the barrier, in a sense, what you've allowed the Israeli legal system and the Israeli state to do implicitly is to say, well, those bits of the barrier that aren't being rerouted through occupied territory, that's fine. They've now got a legal stamp of approval.
There is a price to be paid for engaging with occupiers' system and going on the justice routes that the occupier provides you with. But at the same time, if we're discussing the barrier as an example, the route of the barrier was supposed to take around 16% of the West Bank and leave it on the so-called Israeli side of it, leaving hundreds of thousands of Palestinians without access to their their lands and livelihood. The litigation that challenged that route ended up in shrinking the seam zone, the area between the barrier and the green line, to 8%. So about half of the land that were supposed to be taken were saved. And that means many dozens of thousands of families that have back their livelihood. So for those who say that there is a price to be paid, I say fine, but the price of not going to court will not be paid by those who argue that, but by Palestinians who, what can I say, knock on my door and ask me to represent them. And as a human rights lawyer, I cannot say no.
The broader criticism that is levelled from the left is, and I presume I'm correct in describing you as a Zionist.
Well, you'll have to define Zionism.
Well,
but if Zionism is about the Jewish people having a place where they can exercise their right of self-determination without discriminating against others and without having others not being seen as...
Well, there you are, because that is the criticism from the left, or from some on the left, which is that you've just elucidated the founding contradiction of Zionism, which is for that right to self-determination in that bit of territory that inevitably involves the dispossession, the disqualification of the Palestinian people. How do you square that?
There are millions of people living in Israel and outside Israel who are Jewish, and they feel very strongly that they want to exercise collectively the political right of self-determination. And it would be stupid of me to say, no, this is not a valid demand. There are many other nations that wanted the same thing and received it. And I understand, and of course I understand there is a tension here between that right being realized and what is the status of other people who are not Jewish that live in Israel. And I believe that there is a possibility of living in a state that is both the homeland for the Jewish people and the homeland for Palestinians who live there and have collective rights as a minority. It would not be the first nor the last state that has a majority that is of one ethnicity and a minority of another. The only question is what is the kind of relationship that we will have in that country and what kind of respect we'll have for the citizenship of Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. This is a big challenge, but if we want to respect the desires and the identity of all people between the Jordan River and the sea, we will have to solve this very complex equation.
The Israeli lawyer Michael Sfard, who's just written a book entitled The Wall and the Gate. That's it from